Are you a podcaster? Maybe you've got that big idea and you're looking for a network to join. The multi-award-winning Ozcast Network can get your content to eyes and ears all over the world. Join now for the first month free, and you could be featuring this sound at the beginning of your podcast.
Ozcast.
Simply head to ozcastnetwork.com for details.
Traditionally, Toys for Tots has been a Christmas-time charity. In recent years, the program has evolved into a year-round force for good by distributing toys, games, and books to children in need throughout the year. Last year, during their 75th anniversary, the program distributed over 24 million toys to nearly 10 million less fortunate children and provided over 6.3 million books to children in need through their literacy program. Visit toysfortots.org to support their mission.
Hello world, you're listening to Strategicon, your window to all things security and foreign affairs. In a recent news story, Australia's Director General for the Office of National Intelligence, Nick Warner, made a compelling case about the scale and nature of threats currently facing Australia. He says the greatest threats to Australia come from the following 6 big issues: Sino-American competition, disruptive technological change, regional tensions, population growth in PNG, North Korea, and terrorism. In this episode, John and David will examine these likely threat vectors to Australia and test the veracity of Nick Warner's observations. Before we start today's episode, I would like to remind listeners that Strategicon can be found on the Ozcast Network, iTunes, SoundCloud, Stitcher, TuneIn, Spotify, and on the Sage International Australia website, www.sageinternational.org.au. Welcome, John and David. How are you?
Good Thanks, morning.
Tim. It's good to hear.
Yeah.
Right, so threats to Australia. I'm feeling a little bit scared. I kind of don't want you to crush my world.
Oh man, sorry, just hide under the table. We promise
Duck
it doesn't get any
and
worse.
cover, I think, is the right term we have to use.
Couldn't we just quack and quilt?
Well, we could do that too. Sino-American competition, David. I love Sino-American competition. It's the Cold War we're having when you're not having a Cold War.
Yeah, but the nice thing is happening in a nice war motion.
Yeah. Oh, did you hear the latest? Apparently the Russians are going to receive their first Chinese-built aircraft carrier.
Yeah.
And that's a way to start this.
The Russians at the moment are toying with the idea of having to put theirs out of its misery.
Yeah.
And they need one from someone, and they need it cheaper than they can build it. So if this is an exercise in building a 1970s or 80s Russian aircraft carrier, which would be absolutely fine for decades, fine. Because if you can build it more cheaply in a modern shipyard with labour that are accustomed to building big ships regularly, maybe what we start to see is a little bit of balance, not dissimilar to what we see with France and India. You know, the Indians are gradually starting to build French technology for their own military, and the French don't need that stuff back. But in the Russian case, they do need platforms back that are not necessarily state-of-the-art, so they can fly other things that are state-of-the-art off of them.
So, looking at the bigger picture of Sino-American competition, what are your thoughts with regard to Nick Warner saying that this is like, one of the biggest threats here? I mean, we tend to get a lot of sensational media reports with regard to how China is positioning itself. But we know damn well that the Chinese technology base is not as sophisticated as the US, nor will it ever reach those levels. So how much of a kinetic threat does China pose to forces operating in the Far East?
Well, I think the significant thing is how little Nick Warner said. He didn't say that it's about kinetic, and he didn't talk about cyber and Sino-American competition in the same sentence when he should have. The Chinese advantage, if there is one, is not being a traditional force. And from an Australian perspective, what he also didn't say is, guess what, Australia? We're going to be forced to pick a side.
And we're penetrated, aren't we?
Oh, we're
by Chinese intelligence.
We're penetrated. Yeah. Well, not being rude, but there should have been lube.
Anyway,
we've been penetrated by the Americans since World War II.
Yeah, but we enjoyed the experience, right?
Well, no, we claim we did.
Well, come on, but
we
the Chinese
asked for it.
Well,
Well, come on, we didn't want to die in World War II.
we did ask for it, Tim. You're absolutely right. But we're not asking for the penetration from the Chinese angle, and this is the problem, right?
So Nick is doing a very polite job of not creating political havoc in a country where Labor seem to have drunk the Kool-Aid that the PRC actually wants to eventually become democratic. And Liberals like money but don't trust the PRC.
Oh, come on, David. We've had this discussion before. Surely the more money and the more wealth that gets generated by the Politburo, the softer the Politburo becomes to us. And basically to their own people, right?
I will once again say my favourite line, bah humbug. I see no evidence that wealth leads to civilization or becoming more civil. And if we have a Chinese economy that, though it maintains growth, is also going to have to move more and more to automation to continue to reduce cost, its ability to keep pulling people out of poverty will reduce, which is why they're coming up with the social credit system. They know they need a way of managing people who are going to be less bought off by economic success.
So really is the threat not so much from the competition between the Chinese and the Americans, but really it's the threat posed by a potential regime collapse?
Well, what does a regime have to do to maintain power, and does that hasten regime collapse? And is the United States in any state to do anything about any of this? Does it want to? Can it? Yes, it's got amazing technology, doesn't have enough off of it, isn't building enough new naval ships, can't convince enough capable young Americans to join the military anymore, is having to rebuild from now 15, 18 years of small, dirty wars to prepare for big, expensive, maybe they don't happen wars. Really, both sides have got monumental internal problems that mean it needs to be a lukewarm Cold War.
But surely the American advantage over China is the fact that it has a much more pluralistic system. It has almost an inbuilt robustness that the Chinese simply don't have. I mean, the Chinese have got a brittle structure that if it comes up against an existential threat, it is likely to fall. The Americans will have existential threats. They will take a hit, but they'll bounce back in some capacity later down the track, right?
Pluralism in America at the moment seems to lead to I hate you and you hate me and we're not going to talk anymore.
Yeah, that's happening all over the West right now, though.
Yeah, but the Americans are the ones that are meant to somehow, they wanted to be the policeman, we let them be the policeman.
Well, no one wanted the job. No. And arguably speaking, the Chinese don't want the job either.
Well, here's maybe the key thing that is actually the most relevant thing here. China doesn't want to be global policemen. And the simple rule since World War II is you don't get the lollipop unless you take on the role of global policeman. How can they win if they won't do the job of providing the security necessary?
That leads us to the next really interesting issue about the Sino-American competition aspect, and that is that, yes, the Chinese are quite happy for the Americans to continue doing what they're doing, so long as they can continue to do what they do, and that is, basically pillage whatever they can from the United States technology-wise and get greater advantage, basically, over the US in the US-based system without overtaking the US. But if that's the case, whatever pressure, whether deliberate or not, that the Americans place against China, the Chinese have to be careful that they don't overstretch their own resource base. Because as I said, their system is brittle. Their system can collapse and collapse quite catastrophically, which will lead to all kinds of national security problems in the East Asia area.
Yeah, but it still depends on a US that can conceive of using power effectively.
Do they have to really? I mean, look, we all sort of sit back and talk about Trump in very unflattering terms. And yet, it is under the Trump regime that all of a sudden we've got this trade war between the PRC and the US.
Yeah, but this is a trade war that could be used to break Chinese control on lots of places.
Yes, but is it pretty deliberate? Because we talk about market forces as though they have their own...
No, there's no such thing. There's only what you allow a market to do or don't allow it to do. And in this case, we've got a trade war that could be strategically significant, being turned into a president having a tantrum. So we have trade war light. Enough to be annoying, not enough to get an outcome that is strategically significant.
Unless one side or the other missteps.
Yeah, but why take the risk of a misstep? Why not use a trade war as what it's meant to be, an effective strategic weapon?
And if the Chinese misstep? I mean, the problem is, of course, as I said to you earlier, the Americans have a much more robust system because, the society is more pluralistic. It's based on certain inherent freedoms that the Chinese people don't enjoy. Their technology base is not as advanced as the Americans because obviously when it comes to technology, you need to have your scientists be free in order to pursue various projects, whereas in China, I believe that the scientists will be directed by the state apparatus wherever they have to go to get whatever military level advantage they can. So it's a different form of society, a different form of motivation.
Yeah, but we were on the trade war. Who's selling basic commodities in highland villages in New Guinea? Who's selling basic commodities all over Africa? Who piles basic stuff into most places in the world where people have very little money to spend? The Chinese fundamentally fill the niche of providing those things that everyone needs and no one wants to pay too much for. The Americans don't have that role. So a trade war is not really a trade war unless it affects that ability to deal with that bit of the economy. High-end technology affects high-end weapons, high-end gadgets. Big deal. If you can make stuff for everyone who can't afford expensive stuff, you do okay.
Yeah, but it's kind of like what the Soviets did.
No, they didn't. The Soviets made crap.
Well, they did, but from a comparative advantage, they made crap. But then you could say
there was no comparative advantage when you make crap.
Well,
the Chinese make nice stuff at very affordable prices, which the state subsidizes its way into markets by carrying some of the freight costs or carrying the cost of setting up business to make sure that they own that market.
Who has a Huawei phone?
None of us.
Right.
But how many Africans do?
Yeah. That's true. But then again, at what point then does this Chinese expansion then mean the expansion of Chinese political doctrine to, say, places like the continent of Africa?
Well, who needs to get the doctrine there if you own the trade?
Well,
if
you own the trade.
You own the future of people making money.
Yeah, but you own the trade by, creating a new authoritarian capitalist model, which then becomes attractive to other authoritarians in places like Africa and Latin America.
Yeah, but you don't need to change anything in Africa. You just need to give them stuff to sell. You've already got a clientel system. All you've got to do is say, look, don't move towards democracy. You'd lose all your economic advantages. You wouldn't be able to buy off your population with cheap stuff.
Yes. Okay, so moving to the cheap stuff, disruptive technological change can be cheap, can be very expensive. Nick Warner believes that may actually act as a threat to Australia at some point.
Well, again, here we've got the key difference. We're talking about dropping cheap phones across the world as a way for the Chinese to have markets to survive a trade war that's aimed at too high level. Disruptive technology is, do we want a 5G system that can be turned off and turned back on to work in a different way to benefit a foreign power? No. Of course, disruptive technology we want to avoid, particularly when it is, technology that can provide networks that transform how we do things. Do we want that under control of one country? No. Do we want a multi-vendor 5G system at an absolute minimum, where everyone meets the technical standards, but we get products from 10 different companies from 10 different countries? That'd be awesome.
Would be, but in reality, the cheapest system on the market at the moment comes from the PRC stables.
Yeah, but we're either going to get the deal of having the American system or the Chinese system, because no one else is getting into building 5G. Wouldn't it be nice if we could have some American gear, some Spanish gear, some Italian gear, some French gear, some Chinese gear, and have a system that is all about the interoperability of advanced technical standards? Well, guess what? No one wants anyone to have that, because trade is not about trade. Trade is about politics.
You're not an economist by any chance, are you, David?
No, but neither are economists. If they're honest, they're political economists.
Yeah.
What is the political benefit of the trade decisions we make?
Yeah. So with regard to looking at disruptive technological change, there are a couple of internal things that I think might perhaps tip us over at some point, and that is increasing move towards automation, which will have a social consequence because, of course, the more automation we have, the less people will find traditional work, which then will create ructions within Australia. You'll have small political groups that will come up from, left field and right field and whatever centre faction. And when you've got people that have too much time on their hands, violence ensues.
Okay, let's put the different spin on that. China's already getting to the point of robotic waiters and robotic chefs when labour is cheap, which means their problem with that is infinitely bigger. The real problem we have is the Americans can't offer us that robot-made car cheap enough to be an alternative to what we'll have in 5 years' time, which will be the Chinese robotic-built car. So if it's about a strategic battle between China and America that we're in the middle of, America is failing in the automation stakes dramatically.
If we move on to the next issue that Nick Warner raises, regional tensions. So in terms of threats to Australia, I suppose we look at regional tensions as threats to trade as opposed to, threats to the continent of Australia. India and Pakistan seems to, headline pretty well in that sense, doesn't it?
Yeah, and I suppose what we're seeing there is if they have a war, we lose markets. If they have a war, there'll be refugee flows. So again, we're not directly in the middle of these tensions normally, but we will be affected in terms of access to markets, people needing somewhere safe to be, having the expertise to help clean up after. How involved will we be in providing technical expertise to resolve problems after things go wrong? So the question with this is we don't like instability, we like our island at the end of the world.
The situation between Australia and Indonesia seems to be a perennial one. Well, we don't really know how to handle our northern neighbour. Arguably, we never have.
No, and I don't think we ever will.
No.
For the simple fact that they are doing everything in a hurry.
Yeah.
Going from being a colonial state to a modern country to a modern identity to can they jump into manufacturing at a really significant level? Can they go post-industrial? Well, how do you go post-industrial with nearly 200 million people on small islands? What the heck? So our northern neighbour is so busy working out how to be, and we've not done a very good job of helping them work out how to be in a supportive way. I'm not sure anyone could do a good job of helping them in a supportive way, but we've done a particularly bad job.
It was interesting that Nick Warner also raised the issue of population growth in Papua New Guinea. But if we relate that back to our relations with Indonesia, the sore point that exists between Australia and Indonesia is Papua New Guinea and, of course, over the border in West Papua.
Yeah.
The likelihood of Australia getting itself involved in a stoush with Indonesia over West Papua as time goes on, is that something that you think that we ought to be reconsidering?
Well, look at the APEC conference of agreeing that we will develop a joint base on Manus Island and Manus Bay. The biggest good lagoon left in the Pacific undeveloped, big enough for a complete US fleet. Fantastic forward staging for forces going into New Guinea and along the PNG West Papua border. If this isn't a long-term necessity, but also a long-term risk, I don't know what is.
I suppose if we market it as something that is a forward staging base for operations in the South China Sea, the people in Jakarta will take a sigh of relief and walk away from it and not touch that as a political hot potato.
Yeah.
Will they?
I guess it's that thing, though. We've got massive Chinese economic influence now in PNG. We're now talking about deploying army regularly to do tours, to do capacity building. The Indonesians are the other side of the border. This is time to grow up and switch on and start acting like a very, very smart middle power, because the game is afoot.
Yeah.
And we're slow to the game and we're slow to understand what happens next. And Nick Warner has done a beautiful job of writing very gentle warnings about things that should scare the crap out of us.
Well, this leads us to the fifth topic, North Korea. Now, North Korea has done its fair share of saber rattling over the last few years. It's got its nascent nuclear program. It's got a fleet of ballistic missiles on hair trigger alert, and a million strong army that is also on hair trigger alert. Is the threat posed by North Korea now a little less, considering the fact that we have had Trump and Kim Jong-un have their meetings and continue to have open dialogue between, Pyongyang and Washington? Is this something less of a lesser problem, or do you see that the issue with North Korea will probably ramp up at some point because Kim Jong-un will not give up his only ace in the hole, which is nuclear weapons?
Again, I'll spin it differently and say until we have a meeting that is the American president, the president of the PRC, and the leader of North Korea, and the three of them and sit down and talk about the real issues of PRC needing defence in depth and a way to destabilise US influence in the region, North Korea won't ever be resolved.
That's going to be a highly unlikely scenario.
Which means North Korea will never be resolved.
Crazy things have happened before.
Yeah.
Yeah, crazy things, but not that.
Yeah, crazy things are normally when the weapon goes off accidentally and then everyone ends up in a cataclysm.
Yeah.
Which is why this crazy thing is so frightening.
Yeah.
Because the PRC need defence in depth. The West needs and wants North Korea to calm the heck down.
Can I just put something forward here? The idea of North Korea doing some damage to Western interests, it's often been an interesting point to think about. Say, for instance, the North Koreans will spare one, maybe two of their long-range ballistic missiles that can actually hit northern Australia, to lob one to Darwin or lob one somewhere close to Pine Gap. I mean, we know that the North Koreans don't have really sophisticated targeting capacity, but the sheer effort of doing that would not only terrify the Australian population, so therefore it is a threat, but it would send a signal to America without actually having to do anything to America.
Because we know that the Americans are not going to do anything loopy in response.
No, that's right.
They can't do anything to North Korea, or China's in the game. And Seoul is gone. You can take out Darwin, or Pine Gap almost with impunity.
Yeah, you could.
What's going to the response be? They can't afford to take one.
Which leads us to the next thing, and this is something that Nick doesn't say anything about, and that is the threat that the ANZUS Treaty poses to Australia. Because in the mind frame of Canberra, we put so much emphasis on the ANZUS Treaty that it by itself will be the thing that will save Australia from pretty much any existential threat that we face. But if North Korea were to do the unexpected and lob a couple of missiles to Darwin or Pine Gap, the Americans might be able to take some punitive action against North Korea for the loss of its asset in Pine Gap. But if, for instance, the missile lands right in the CBD of Darwin, kills God knows how many.
All of Darwin.
Oh, well, it could kill all of Darwin, or even just a handful of people. I mean, what would the American response? Obviously, the Australian people
I think the Americans would go, this is terrible, but that's not an existential threat.
Right.
They just used up their one missile.
Yeah.
What do you expect us to do with the PRC on the other side of the border? What do you expect us to do when they can light Seoul up and kill the equivalent of your entire country's population? Not just one city of 300,000.
Yeah.
So this idea that the ANZUS Treaty will save us, it would save us in a World War II type scenario where the American need bases for conventional operations. What we think we're going to get out of ANZUS, we ticked the ANZUS box after 9/11 to get toys and to get technology and to get intel.
Yeah.
It's what we can get that matters, not what the Americans will do for us unless they need a coalition of the willing. And
we're always willing
American
for that.
listeners, feel free to get angry. If you want to come on and argue with me, more than happy to.
That's a challenge. Okay, so the last of the things that Nick Warner believes is a significant threat to Australia is obviously terrorism. So with regard to terrorism, Australian shores have been touched by that plague, but it's been touched very lightly. Our response arguably has been over and above what perhaps should have been the case, but nonetheless, we have a population still very much panicked by the idea, the very thought of terrorism growing out of the local Muslim communities now, with homegrown terrorists being a big thing. So what do you see as the future of terrorism moving forward in Australia? Can we get on top of it? Is the threat overblown? And will it always be pretty much contained to the worst parts of terrorism always remaining in the Middle East and North Africa?
Do you remember the night we were sitting at your place, there were about 8 of us, and the news popped up of what Anders Breivik had done in Norway?
Yep.
And we all sat there and went, gulp, and then had a conversation about, well, how long before the pendulum swings from it being about radical Islamist terrorism to it being about white supremacist terrorism. And okay, I don't remember how long ago Breivik is. Was it
2011?
I think it was about then, yeah.
Yeah, we could always put the right date in the show notes if need be.
Yeah.
But we had already had the, oh, this is not about Norway moment. We went, oh, cultural transformation that's partially choice, partially unplanned, and economic pressure post-GFC. When's that storm going to hit Australia? You know, it's just dumb luck it hit New Zealand before it hit us. So once again, Nick's done a wonderful thing of providing a warning without providing a real warning about actually what the next threat is. And the next threat is not what will happen somewhere in Western Sydney because a dislocated young Muslim is seduced into radical Islam. It's just as likely to be a young Anglo-Saxon white guy in Western Sydney gets angry.
New Zealand was like
An Australian.
An Australian,
Yeah. And we shall not say his name again. Best thing Jacinda Ardern did was say, don't ever give this guy oxygen.
Absolutely.
Don't let him be a martyr.
Yep.
So we'll call him the perpetrator. Yeah, the perp was Australian, which means could it just as easily happened here? And all right, some people, if you want to say, oh yes, but we got rid of the weapons. No. As terrorism shows us, you'll use the weapon if it's easy to get. Failing that, you'll build a bomb. Failing that, you'll use a truck. You'll use whatever is available to create the havoc you want to create to show I do not want a modern inclusive world.
And as the perpetrator of Christchurch showed quite devastatingly, and that is that, terrorism is an ever-changing, ever-adapting methodology. You want to cause harm if you think that certain things that you once could get away with have been shut down. You look for other targets. You look for other ways. Absolutely.
It's
not about being able to sort of look at any form of terrorism in a dogmatic way.
No.
Yeah.
It's the flexibility. So, like we said at the start, this is a wonderful document to not frighten the population, but also not really tell them the answers. Each of these things can be spun to a deeper, clearer point of analysis. That if people were aware, it would be, where's the policy to respond to the actual deeper issues?
That's what this election would be about.
Well, it should be about if we were having a proper election, as opposed to who do we want, the do-nothings or the do-nothing part twos. Whereas actually what we need is policy about each of these things, but analysed deeply and effectively.
Yeah. Okay, that's a wrap. Thanks very much for joining us, David and Tim.
Thank you, gentlemen.
Okay.
Thanks for listening, everyone. We hope that you'll join us for our next exciting adventure through the world of geopolitics.
Where I promise not to frighten you.
Remember that you can subscribe to Strategicon through the Ozcast network, iTunes, SoundCloud, Stitcher, TuneIn and Spotify. And please like us on the Sage International Australia Facebook site and follow us on Twitter. We appreciate your support. Also, please comment on any of our articles and podcasts through Facebook, LinkedIn, Twitter, and of course on the Sage International Australia website. We welcome any constructive feedback that can help us improve our products, and we look forward to engaging with our followers. Until next time, goodbye.
Up to $26,000 per employee? They call it the 15-minute refund, but it's not a gimmick. It's for business owners who stuck it out during the pandemic. The Employee Retention Tax Credit, or ERTC. But time is running out to get started. Talk to the experts. JWC Advisors at iHeartTaxRefunds.com. Who are they? CPAs who will keep you on the right side of the IRS. So do it the right way. Go to iHeartTaxRefunds.com. That's iHeartTaxRefunds.com.
Are you a podcaster? Maybe you've got that big idea and you're looking for a network to join. The multi-award-winning Ozcast Network can get your content to eyes and ears all over the world. Join now for the first month free, and you could be featuring this sound at the beginning of your podcast.
Ozcast.
Simply head to ozcastnetwork.com for details.